What do you know about the aboleth? Older than the gods, these ancient aberrations dwell in the deepest and darkest places of the world. Inspired by the eldritch abominations from the mind of American cosmic horror author H.P. Lovecraft, with versions of them even adapted into 21st century cinema, the aboleths are truly one of the most terrifying and alien creatures in all of modern fantasy. Ahoy everyone, I'm Nazir North and welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to examine the aboleth in Dungeons & Dragons and talk about how you as the game master could use them in your campaign at your table. In aboleth lore, before the gods arrived in the universe, the aboleths ruled an empire by enslaving all other primitive life forms they came across. However, when the gods finally arrived, they destroyed the aboleth empire and freed their slaves. The aboleths weren't wiped out though, they retreated to the dark lakes and subterranean oceans where they remember this attack by the gods and still harbour that resentment against them. From where they now live in their dark underwater lairs, the monster manual for 5th edition D&D notes a number of regional effects that an aboleth's presence can have on the nearby environment. Surfaces become slimy and wet, making them difficult terrain. Water becomes foul and unsafe to drink. And finally, the most interesting regional effect is that the aboleth can use an action to create an illusory copy of itself. The aboleth can even see and speak through this copy from up to a mile away. So, before we even look at their stat block, what do we already know about aboleths, their motivations, and what might drive them to either work with or against an adventuring party? They are old. Very old. Older even than the gods. They have, according to the monster manual, near perfect memory and recall. They know things that no living mortal now could possibly know. They fell from power, from once having a grand empire to now having almost nothing. They hate the gods, as they are responsible for the fall of their empire. They live in the watery depths, so we could be looking at ocean trenches, flooded cave systems, or the great lakes and seas of the Underdark. And the area near their lair is inhospitable, with treacherous terrain and foul water. Other creatures are not going to want to live anywhere near the lair of an aboleth. Okay, these things should already be getting the wheels turning in your head about how we can use the aboleth in your game. As a monster which perhaps holds a grudge against a particular god who harmed them in the distant past. Maybe even a god which a member of the party follows. Or maybe as an ally to the party if one of their goals is to kill or dethrone a god, even an evil god. As let's bear in mind, the aboleths hate all gods. I don't think they would distinguish on the basis of domains or moral values. They hate them all. Alright, let's take a look at the stat block. The aboleth is a large aberration. Aberration being the category for most of those Lovecraftian style monsters in D&D 5th edition. It has a 17 armor class, which is decent, and 135 hit points on average, which a party will chew through pretty quickly if you're not careful. Its base walking speed is only 10 feet, but it has a swim speed of 40 feet, meaning it's never really going to willingly want to leave the water. It has a pretty good range of ability scores across the board, the only weak one really being dexterity at 9. The highlights here though are its strength, intelligence and charisma scores. On saving throws it also has proficiency in constitution, intelligence and wisdom. Con and wisdom are both fairly common saves to make, so they're good saving throws to be proficient in. It's proficient in history as a skill, which we could have guessed from its description around them having long memories, but they also have dark vision and a plus 10 to perception, which gives them a passive perception of 20, which is really good. The aboleth has deep speech, but that doesn't really matter too much as it has telepathy, which you don't need a shared language for across two creatures to use, so the aboleth can effectively speak to anyone. The given challenge rating is 10, so if you are running them as a solo boss encounter, a party of 4 should be around about level 7 minimum to go up against the aboleth. Although I wouldn't recommend running it solo, boss battles are always better when there are other threats on the battlefield. If you want to check out my video on running complex and smart combat encounters, you can check out the link to the video in the corner now. On to features and traits. As we could have already assumed, the aboleth can breathe air and water, although it's almost certainly going to prefer to fight underwater. With the aboleth's mucus cloud feature, a creature underwater with the aboleth may receive a disease, which means they can only breathe underwater for a number of hours. This is a really interesting feature and can actually be a benefit for a party member if they didn't already have water breathing from some other source, like the water breathing spell, for example. It means that in a fight with an aboleth, at least the party aren't really at much risk of drowning, although that probably shouldn't be their main concern if they're fighting an aboleth. I could also see this ability being willingly given to the players by an aboleth who is their ally. Perhaps the party have some quest to follow which leads them underwater, and the aboleth could aid them by giving them temporary water breathing. The next feature is probing telepathy, which lets the aboleth learn a creature's greatest desires. Interestingly, there is no saving throw or roll or ability check for this. As long as the aboleth can see the creature, it just works. And with a passive perception score of 20, they almost certainly can see the creature. This feature, along with the aboleth's high mental scores, mean that the first encounter with an aboleth is probably going to be a diplomatic one rather than a straight up fight, where the aboleth probably tries to manipulate the party to achieve its own goals. And this is something we already know that the aboleths do. They made an entire empire on slaves. They didn't just kill everyone, they manipulated them into their service. And based on that, I don't think the aboleth is the type of creature to attack on sight. It will first try and convince other creatures to join them before resorting to violence. On actions, the aboleth has a very basic tail attack, but what is really interesting here is the extra effect it gets from its tentacle attack. This synergizes well with the mucus cloud feature we've already talked about, as the tentacle attack has a chance to essentially make the target completely water dependent. Their skin becomes translucent and slimy, and they take damage whenever they aren't in water. This, along with giving a creature water breathing from its mucus, basically turns the creature into a fish. This attack also specifically states that you need the heal spell or other magic of 6th level or higher to cure it. That means that even a spell like Greater Restoration isn't going to cut it. Most spellcasters aren't going to get 6th level spells until their character is at least level 11, so that's one other reason not to run the aboleth as a solo monster at lower levels, as even if the party manage to kill the aboleth, unless they have a friendly healer NPC nearby, they probably aren't going to have any way to cure this effect. The aboleth also has the enslave action, which it can use up to 3 times a day. This is by far the most powerful ability the aboleth has. This turns the target into a literal thrall of the aboleth. If done in battle, this could swing an encounter really heavily in favour of the aboleth. But I also imagine the aboleth using this fairly commonly outside of combat as well. If the aboleth can't first convince you to do its bidding, why not just directly take control of your mind and force you to do it? While the DC for this effect is only a 14, and it is a wisdom saving throw, which a lot of player classes will be quite good at, if it does stick, especially in combat, it's a really powerful ability. And as a boss type monster, the aboleth does have legendary actions, 2 of which are very basic. It can make a perception check to look for hidden enemies, or it can make a tail attack. However, it also has Psychic Drain, which lets the aboleth harm one of its charmed creatures to then heal itself. This is an interesting action, although I personally wouldn't use this in combat, because when a charmed creature from that enslave action takes damage, they can repeat their saving throw to try and break out of the aboleth's control. And the healing that the aboleth receives is only 3d6, which is an average of 10 hit points. That's not very much. It's just not worth the risk, in my opinion. Rather than risk losing the thrall, use that thrall to burn through all of their abilities and spell slots to try and take down the players. That's worth far more than an extra 10 hit points. Now, even though they aren't actually on the stat block, although I personally think they should be, maybe that's something Wizards of the Coast will reconsider when they release 1 D&D later this year, the aboleth also has lair actions, assuming it is in its lair when the fight starts. The first lair action allows the aboleth to cast the Phantasmal Force spell on as many creatures as it can see within 60 feet, so potentially the entire party. It requires concentration to maintain this effect, which is okay for the aboleth because it does have a +6 to its con saves. However, the aboleth can't take another lair action while Phantasmal Force is still active. So the aboleth would probably choose to have this up for 1 full round in combat, then willingly drop concentration before the next Lair action comes around in order to be able to use another one. There is one issue with this action in the monster manual which seems to be an oversight in the text, and that is that there is no DC given for Phantasmal Force, and as the aboleth isn't a spellcaster, it doesn't have a spell save DC anywhere on its stat block. So when a party member tries to roll an investigation check to get out of the Phantasmal Force's spell effect, you don't know what number they need to roll. Now, the other saving throw based abilities on the aboleth stat block all have a DC of 14. Using some maths, we know that a CR10 creature has a +4 proficiency bonus, and that DCs are calculated as 8 plus proficiency plus the relevant ability modifier. This means that the DCs on the block of 14 are either based on the aboleth's constitution score or its wisdom score, as they both have a +2, resulting in a DC of 14. However, the recommended saving throw in the Dungeon Master's Guide for a saving throw for a challenge 10 monster is 16, not 14. And while I could see the tentacle or mucus cloud effects being constitution based, surely Enslave and any other spell casting or mind related effects should be based on either the aboleth's intelligence or charisma scores, which are higher. Because of that, I'd assume that the spell save DC is 16, but you can't really be wrong if you also just go with 14 because that's what's on the block elsewhere. It's really just a case of Wizards of the Coast forgetting to add the DC into the book. Maybe it's been fixed since by an errata in later versions, I'm not really sure. If you do know, let me know in the comments. I know at least that it's wrong in my physical copy of the Monster Manual and on the D&D Beyond version, which I've been referring to in this video too. Right, anyway, back to the Lair actions. The next Lair action allows the aboleth to manipulate the water around them to drag in any nearby creatures that might still be standing on land. This one aligns perfectly with the aboleth's preferred fighting style. It's going to want its foes to be in the water with it. And the last Lair action is a fairly basic Psychic Rage type attack that can reach all creatures within 90 feet of the aboleth. This one is okay, but it only does 2d6 damage, so it's not terribly powerful. Alright, given what we've learned then, let's break down how you might build a combat encounter around an aboleth in your game. We already know that the aboleth's combat preference is always going to be to fight underwater. Its speed on land is extremely limiting, and I can't imagine the aboleth ever leaving the water unless they had no other choice. In combat, its tactics are going to look a little something like this. As it wants to make the most of its limited Enslave ability, it's going to pop that straight away on round 1 and then probably move deeper into the water to get some distance on the party. As ranged weapons are going to have reduced range underwater, weapons like bows will have disadvantage, and the players are going to probably try and get close to the aboleth. That means it can swim around and lead the party into a more dangerous part of its lair, or maybe lead it into groups of its minions. Its tail attack is probably going to be its preferred legendary action when it's not the aboleth's actual turn, as the chances are at least one player is going to be able to make it up to melee range as the aboleth moves backwards. When it comes to its Lair actions, unless there are some players that are still on land that it can use that Grasping Tide move on, the aboleth is probably just going to keep switching back and forth between Phantasmal Force and that Psychic Rage effect. During the fight, the aboleth is going to actively try to slink back into darkness or gain cover so that it's out of sight of the party. When it does so, it may want to use its regional effect as an action to create an illusory copy of itself. It could then swim that copy out into the battle as a decoy. Even though the copy vanishes as soon as it takes damage, that is still an attack or spell that could have hit the real aboleth that has instead been safely expended on the copy. And although it could be a little frustrating for the party to try and deal with this, there's no limit on this action. If one of the aboleth's copies gets destroyed, it can just make a new one on its next turn, constantly giving the players this 50-50 chance of hitting the fake aboleth instead of the real one, assuming it's manoeuvred around in a smart way. Again, the Monster Manual doesn't actually specify when the illusory copy moves if you're in a combat scenario. However, the most logical answer to this seems to be to just allow that illusory copy to move on the aboleth's turn as the actual real aboleth does. That way the players wouldn't really know which one is the real one. As a bit of a sidebar, although the default range of the illusory copy is 1 mile, the aboleth can also create the copy in any location that one of its charmed or enslaved creatures can see. This instantly gives me two ideas. One of the aboleth's minions, acting as an ambassador, can sort of summon this holographic version of the aboleth to speak to others. This could be its primary method of communicating with people who live on land, while the real aboleth is still safely in its lair. Additionally, the aboleth could actually work as a great warlock patron using this ability, with the image of the aboleth literally appearing before the warlock whenever they have a task for them. Anyway, back to combat. Once the aboleth has expended all 3 uses of its enslave action, which it probably is going to use every turn in those first 3 rounds of initiative, it's probably only then that it's actually going to swim into melee to finish off any remaining foes with its tentacle attacks. If the aboleth starts to win the fight, it would almost certainly choose to hit the creatures unconscious so they remain stable, rather than trying to kill them outright. This way the aboleth has more minions to add to their forces. A dead adventurer is worth nothing to them. Also, in a meta sense, if the players lose the fight, this then gives them a second chance to try and escape the aboleth's control, rather than going straight to a TPK and potentially ending your campaign. In terms of the aboleth's lair, it's obviously going to prefer very deep and very dark water where it can use verticality and move in all 3 dimensions. It's probably also going to want to have some caves or overhangs deep in the water that it can use for cover and stay out of sight when it wants to. The lair probably also has wide underwater passageways that lead out into other bodies of water, so the aboleth has multiple methods of escape when they need it. Because remember, aboleths are intelligent and ancient creatures. They probably aren't going to choose to fight to the death. If they see things going badly for them, they're going to try and flee to live another day, and maybe come back for revenge at a later time. They were already beaten by the gods and survived. They're in no rush to die. They have patience. The aboleth's lair probably won't have much in the way of traps, but it could have some weak ceilings or stone columns that could be collapsed in an emergency, either to block off an entryway or to drop rocks on an enemy. The lair also doesn't need to be a natural underwater cavern. It could be artificial in some way. It could even be a sunken city in an Atlantis type situation. Use your imagination and see what you come up with here. Within a mile of its lair, the aboleth is also going to have its illusory copy active pretty much all of the time. There's really no reason why the aboleth wouldn't use that illusory copy as effectively a permanent scout circling the perimeter of its lair. For the final part of this discussion, let's spend some time talking about the aboleth's potential allies. As I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't advise running the aboleth as a solo boss monster. Make sure it has some allies on the field or elsewhere in the lair. Now, firstly, I don't think the aboleth would be aligned to any natural creatures or beasts like giant sharks or aquatic dinosaurs, as we know from its regional effects that the water near the aboleth becomes foul and undrinkable, so it probably doesn't become a suitable environment for those kinds of creatures. We might also be initially drawn to creatures that like being underwater, like the aboleth does, but that's already where the aboleth excels. I think the aboleth is actually more likely to seek allies who can operate on land, where the aboleth itself struggles. So we are looking for creatures who can see in the dark, because the lair is almost certainly going to be underground or so deep in the ocean that no light reaches it. We need them to be able to operate effectively on land, although an additional swimming speed wouldn't go amiss. And we need them to be plausibly enthralled or enslaved by the aboleth, so no creatures that are immune to charm. I'm also just going to stick to monsters from the monster manual for this video, so we don't exclude any DMs who don't own every single 5th edition book, because let's face it, there are a lot of them by this point. So, taking all of that into consideration, here are some of the best candidates in no particular order. The Kuo-toa. They also like living in the Underdark, and they're often hunted by the drow. So you could definitely see them seeking the protection of a more powerful creature in exchange for their service, and potentially worship. The Kuo-toa also have an ethereal sense which allows them to see invisible creatures, so they would be a great ally to have guarding the entrances to your lair. Myconids, the sort of fungal mushroom people from D&D 5th edition, they also have some mind-altering abilities that might synergize well with the aboleth. They release these sort of mind-controlling and telepathic spores. So I could also see an entire myconid colony sprouting up on the land above the aboleth's lair. As with the Kuo-toa, this works best in an underground setting. Kobolds. They like burrowing and they are very good at laying traps. They also like to live in the dark and to live underground. Kobolds are really just overall a great minion for a range of different powerful monsters. To convince the kobolds to join them, the aboleth may even be tricking the kobolds into thinking that it's actually a dragon. Next, the
Sahuagin. Sahuagin.
Right, thanks, Matt. The Sahuagin are another great contender here, filling that same kind of role as the Kuo-toa would. The Sahuagin are probably a better fit for a deep sea lair though, rather than a more traditional underwater cave lair. Although lesser known, I'd also add the Quaggoths to this list. Although their default stat block is pretty basic, they do like to live in the Underdark, and they have a variant spellcaster form in the monster manual that can cast Cure Wounds, so that could be a really good ally to have nearby in a fight, particularly if the aboleth ever gets stranded on land. The final type of ally that the aboleth could have is anything. Literally anything. Yet pretty much any person or creature that could have previously fallen victim to the aboleth could now be its minion. The aboleth could have charmed it and infected it with its diseases that make it turn translucent and its skin go slimy and become dependent on the water to live. And remember, it can also grant through that mucus cloud water breathing. So after all of that, that creature could now be in service to the aboleth. So if you're in the Underdark, imagine a hook horror that stumbled upon an aboleth's lair. Well, now it serves the aboleth too. Hook horrors might not be great swimmers, but perhaps they scour the seabed or scale the walls of a submerged ruined castle. You could even have former adventurers and mercenaries whose skin has now gone pale and slimy who also serve the aboleth. There is a lot of possibility here, but I would try and stick to creatures still that have a good thematic fit with the aboleth. For example, I wouldn't just put a dragon down there. And also try and aim for creatures that already have dark vision and possibly ones that have a swimming speed already. If you have the Ghosts of Saltmarsh book, there is a creature in there called the Scum, or the Scoom, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, which is essentially this. It's a humanoid that became an aboleth slave through the transformation and other conditions that the aboleth can confer. So you could use that stat block if you have that book, or just modify an existing stat block from the monster manual. Give it water breathing and an effect so that it takes damage whenever it's outside of water, and you're ready to go. Okay, so we're almost finished. Let's just do a quick summary of some of the key points to remember when using the aboleth in 5th edition. They will generally attempt to use diplomacy and manipulation first before jumping into combat. They likely have a network of operatives that can work on land. The aboleth will use its illusory copy as a scout and mouthpiece, while it keeps its true form hidden somewhere safe. It only fights underwater in its lair where it has the upper hand. And finally, it's a smart creature, so it will attempt to flee rather than fighting to the death. And that's it for this one. I hope this video has convinced you that the aboleth is a great monster to include in your campaign, whether that's as the villain or a tenuous ally. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. If you want to see other monster breakdown videos, such as one where I talk about goblins, kobolds and skeletons, or if you want to see me making some maps for D&D, you can check out those cards on the end screen. Cheers for watching, I will see you next time.